California Dreaming is brought to you by BLUBRRY. You know, there is a little bit more to making a podcast than just talking into a mic and hitting publish. You need more than that. And I'm talking about a reliable hosting service so your time can be spent working on your show. You also want accurate download numbers, you want to see the audience that you're reaching, and you're going to want a webpage that is simple and easy to work with. That's why I choose BLUBRRY. With its simple media hosting and fully integrated WordPress website, it can't get any easier. So if you host a show or if you're thinking about starting one, visit www.orbitaljigsaw.com/dream to give BLUBRRY a try for a month for free. BLUBRRY's support team will be right there every step of the way to help you migrate over so you won't lose any of your subscribers in the process. And if you're brand new to this, they can get your new show up and running. And with a month for free to try it out using promo code DREAM, what have you got to lose? There are a number of ways that you can support California Dreaming. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can spread the word about the show. You can recommend us in podcast and true crime fan groups. And you can leave the show a rating and a review on iTunes or whichever platform you listen to the show on. And if you would like to go a little above and beyond, you can support the show on our Patreon. For as little as $1 a month, you can gain access to one exclusive episode per month, and there are currently about 45 episodes that you can binge. So it's a pretty good deal for $1, although some of those, about 8 of them I think, are at the $5 and above level. This week, I would like to thank Joy W., Michelle G., Zoe H., Candace E., Tamar C., Helen J., Marie P., Annabelle C., Shonda S., L. Firebrand, Samantha L., Ruth, Marie Pierce, and Sam M. for joining Patreon. If you have joined in the last couple of weeks and you haven't heard your name yet, don't worry, it's coming. And also, the first wave of thank you cards was sent out this week. Well, the first wave since about the beginning of the year. Another set of thank you cards will be going out very soon. That is, if you've opted in. And if you're not interested in a monthly donation, you can help with a one-time donation to our show through PayPal using our email, californiapod@gmail.com. And I'd like to thank you so much for your ongoing support. So I hope all is well with everyone out there amid this ongoing quarantine. Whether it's mandatory where you live or not, many of us are opting to stay put at home as much as possible. Here in Nevada, it isn't mandatory for us to stay home, but we are leaving only when we really have to. So you can imagine that I have had some extra time on my hands to go through some pretty lengthy episodes, and there's also been some pretty heavy cases as well. On the regular show, we had 2 back-to-back cases that were exceedingly violent. We talked about Gabriel Fernandez, and then we followed that up with Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom, which was a vacation episode out of Tennessee. Those were graphic and upsetting for some of you, and if you didn't listen, I totally get it. And if you're a Patreon supporter, there were 2 episodes that were available for the month of April. For supporters at all tier levels, we discussed the 2000 murder of Navy veteran and schoolteacher Frank Rodriguez. And as a second bonus for supporters at the $5 tier and above, to go along with our recent episode out of Tennessee, we discussed the 2012 double murders of Billy Payne and Billie Jean Hayworth, a couple who had just welcomed the birth of their first child 7 months earlier. That case made bigger headlines outside of the state of Tennessee than the murders of Channon and Christopher. It involved a very bizarre and convoluted plot orchestrated by then 30-year-old social recluse Janelle Potter, who spent the better part of more than a year duping and manipulating her parents and her boyfriend into believing that she was the target of an ongoing hate campaign against her perpetrated by the murdered couple and their friends, when it was clear, based on Janelle's internet and social media activities, as well as the subsequent activity of her mother, who joined in her crusade to fight back against Janelle's tormentors, that it was in fact Janelle who was doing all of the harassing. She got her parents so worked up by pretending that she was a CIA agent named Chris, who had been sent to Mountain City, Tennessee, in order to surveil, identify, and eliminate the problem. Janelle's father, with the assistance of her boyfriend, ended up taking matters into their own hands, believing that they were working under the behest and protection of the CIA. The story had been told on a couple of podcasts, but I went into as much detail as I could about the information that came out in court as to the electronic correspondence between Janelle, her mom, and her boyfriend, as well as the fictitious CIA agent that she was catfishing everyone with. Again, that's an episode at the $5 tier and above on Patreon, of which there are about 8. And surprisingly and thankfully, despite everything that's going on in the world right now, our Patreon support has remained steady, for which I am very grateful, and I hope that the content on there, as well as our regular free episodes, are helping get you through some of these long days in isolation, at least for a little while. The writing and recording had been helping me up until this last week when I sustained a pretty bad head injury, but I've gotten a little bit antsy, and I'm trying to stay focused as much as possible in working on the show. I appreciate all of your patience with the randomness that the episodes have been coming out, and I keep thinking that I'm going to try to stick to a schedule, but I always seem to fall behind for one reason or another. And as I had mentioned, I took a pretty bad spill last week and knocked my head around pretty badly. It took me a few days to recover, and I'm still not completely feeling back to my normal self, but I am ready enough to try and get this recorded for you guys. But anyways, again, thank you for putting up with this and sticking with it. Oftentimes, a story idea pops into my head while I'm in the middle of researching other cases. And for the most recent Patreon bonus on the murders of Billy and Billie Jean in Mountain City, Tennessee, I was kind of reminded of another story, and it's a totally different story, but in the same vein of someone pretending to be something that they're not. While Janelle Potter hid behind the anonymity of the internet to masquerade as a CIA agent, the woman at the center of the story that I'm going to share with you today had the look, she had the money, she had the cars, the clothes, the designer bags, the little chihuahua with the bedazzled collar stowed away in said designer bag, and the game to pull off a con in real life. And by the end of the story, I'm not even sure if we're going to be able to say for certain who this woman really was and is. In this 144th episode of California Dreaming, the tale of the drug Queenpin of Beverly Hills. If you were going to try to pass yourself off as the heir or heiress of some massively successful and wealthy family, what family would you choose? One big case that made headlines involved a German man named Christian Gerhardtstreiter. I think that's how it's pronounced. It's pretty long. He went by at least 5, likely more aliases throughout his life, but most notably, he took on the name of Clark Rockefeller, of the Rockefeller family, having immigrated from Germany in the 18th century, settling here in the United States to become one of the wealthiest industrial, political, and banking families in the world. A fortune that was amassed from the late 19th and early 20th century by brothers John and William Rockefeller through their company Standard Oil. And it is a case that I've been wanting to talk about on the show since the beginning, but I just haven't gotten around to it. But the woman at the center of this case created quite an elaborate backstory as to who she was and from which wealthy family she was an heiress of. Her name, she said, was Lisette Lee, and she claimed that her mother was the daughter of the founder of Samsung, Lee Byung-chul, who actually had several children. He himself was born in 1910 and he passed away in 1987. His first wife was born in 1907 and passed away in 1999. From his first marriage, he had a daughter in 1929 and she passed away in 2019. His first son was born in 1932 and passed away in 2014. His second son was born in 1934 and passed away in 1992. His second daughter was born in 1936 and is still alive. His third daughter was born in 1938, his fourth in 1940. His third son was born in 1942. His fifth daughter was born in 1944. Lee Byung-chul divorced and it remarried, it seems, very shortly after the birth of his fifth daughter, as he went on to have a fourth son in 1946 and a sixth daughter in 1954 with his second wife. So, the founder of Samsung had a total of 10 children. So I tried to figure out which of these 6 daughters of the Samsung founder that Lisette claimed to be the daughter of by doing the math. Lisette was born in 1981. An exact date is not known, but she was apparently born in Seoul, South Korea. Later on, we will have the name of who is said to have been her mother, but that's going to be towards the end of the story. But for now, the most likely to have been her birth mother would have been daughter number 6. That would have made her 34 years old at the time that Lisette was born in 1988. Daughter number 5 was born 10 years earlier in 1944, which would have made her 44 years old in 1988 when Lisette was born, which is still plausible but not as likely. And the likelihood of daughters 4, 3, 2, and 1 being her mom become increasingly less likely, as they would have been 48, 50, 52, and 59 respectively in 1998. I tried to look up daughter number 6, but when I searched for Samsung founder's youngest daughter, I'm directed to his youngest daughter from his first marriage, who is listed as the 12th richest person in South Korea. And unfortunately, the youngest daughter from the second marriage shares the exact same name with the South Korean athlete who competed in the 1964 Olympics in the javelin throw. Other searches only bring up her dad and one of her brothers, the third son of the Samsung founder. Interestingly enough, and I know I'm going to get sidetracked here, but hey, we're in quarantine. You've got nothing better to do than to listen to me sidetrack, right? The third son of the Samsung founder and current chairman, he's had some turmoil of his own in his life involving 2 of his 4 children. His oldest son, who is currently the vice chairman of Samsung, was actually convicted in August of 2017 of bribery, embezzlement, perjury, corruption, etc., and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. The whole thing involved a transition of power and ownership in Samsung from his father to him in 2014. They were accused of bribing the then president of South Korea and a close friend of hers with $30 million in order to be granted government favors to assist in a smooth transition of power. His sentence was reduced on February 8, 2018 on appeal, which reduced it 2.5 years, at which time he was immediately released. Now, his father is the third son of the Samsung founder. He's no Boy Scout either, and I'm only mentioning this all because I found it really interesting that you could be a part of one of the richest families in the world and in charge of the number 1 top-ranked company in its industry, and yet still it's not enough money, right? Well, this guy's home was raided several years ago in January of 2008 as a part of the Korean police's investigation into the accusations that the Samsung Group money was being used to bribe prosecutors, judges, and political figures in South Korea. A few months later, on April 11, 2008, he resigned as chairman of the Samsung Group and his son transitioned in as chairman, which I just talked about him and his own scandal. Subsequent to that, on July 16, 2008, he too was found guilty of corruption and tax evasion. Prosecutors sentenced him to 7 years in prison and fined him 350 billion won, which is about $312 million. But instead, the court fined him 110 billion won or $98 million, along with 3 years of a suspended jail sentence. But on December 29, 2009, a year and a half after his conviction, he was pardoned by the then president of South Korea. A book was later written by the lead attorney representing Samsung, and he claimed that during his time as chairman of Samsung, as much as 10 trillion won, or $8.9 billion, was stolen from the company and its subsidiaries. Evidence was destroyed, and government officials were bribed in order to ensure that a smooth transition of power was going to happen when his son stepped down. But it wasn't over yet, because in March of 2010, the former chairman announced that he was returning to that position with Samsung, and within 2 years, Samsung became the largest earning electronics company in the world, the company itself representing 20% of South Korea's gross domestic product, and he himself became the richest man in South Korea. However, in 2014, he suffered a heart attack, which left him unable to fulfill his duties as chairman, but he's still hanging on to his job. Technically, his son is the one who was taken over when he resigned, became the de facto chairman once again, and his most recent legal woes surfaced yet again in February of 2018 when it was revealed that he was being investigated for a second time for tax evasion. He allegedly used bank accounts in someone else's name that contained about 4 billion won or $368 million in order to evade taxes. However, he remains incapacitated, and what is going on with that now, there has been no update since. And as I was looking at the Samsung family, I found a very sad footnote in all of this. And I'm sorry if I'm avoiding using everyone's names here because it's becoming really confusing, but you gotta get the idea. Their names are short, they're hyphenated, they're similar and difficult to move back and forth through. But the chairman of Samsung, the son of the founder, the one who has his son in charge right now, but only as a placeholder, it hasn't been made official yet. Well, his daughter apparently had a troubled and dark and lonely existence of her own. And I'll tell you her name. Her name was Yoon Hung. But I'm going to call her Yoon, not out of disrespect, I hope, but just to try to keep it as simple as possible. She was born April 26, 1979. She was the youngest of 4 children, and this would make her the granddaughter of the founder of Samsung. She was a graduate of Iha Women's University in Seoul, earning her bachelor's in the French language and French literature. In 2005, she was a first-year graduate student at New York University's Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development, on top of which she held about $191 million in Samsung stock. In November of 2005, in the independent.co.uk, it said that Yoon loved fast cars and fine art, and then she was found hanging in her Manhattan apartment, a tragedy that cast a shadow over one of the world's wealthiest families. It went on to say that she was young at the time she was 26. She was smart, beautiful, rich beyond many of our wildest dreams. She had just moved to New York. She had just enrolled in NYU. But on November 18, 2005, she was found hanging by an electrical cord wrapped around her neck in her luxurious East Village Astor Place apartment in Lower Manhattan. Subsequent to her death, reports surfaced that her father had forbidden her from marrying a man that she was in love with. A man who was pretty much a regular middle-class working guy. Yoon was not working for Samsung, and she had no direct involvement other than her stock holdings, but the family did provide for her exceedingly well. In the wake of her death, reports coming out of South Korea indicated that she had died in a car accident, and that story played out for a little while. That is until 3 reporters from a New York-based paper called the Korea Times discovered a number of inconsistencies coming from the powers that be at Samsung. There were no reports as to where exactly this car accident occurred. Some had said it happened in New York City. Others said it happened outside of the city. Nobody witnessed this accident. And the most glaring inconsistency is that the NYPD had nothing in its records of Yoon having been involved in a fatal car accident. Eventually, Samsung came with the truth, but they said that they were led to believe in the beginning that she had perished in a car accident, and it was never their intentions to mislead anyone. They regarded this a personal matter to the Lee family, and in an effort to preserve her dignity as well as respect for the family, they opted to not correct the reports that she had indeed died of suicide by hanging. In South Korea, it's been said that there is a stigma when it comes to a person who dies by suicide. But those who did the digging into her death stateside have said that more important than it is to have the truth about a person's death out there, that she deserved to have the correct version of how her story ended to be told. Out of her 3 siblings, an older brother and 2 older sisters, Yoon was known to be the most outgoing. However, she did maintain a very guarded private life, and this is how her family preferred it. She ranked as one of South Korea's wealthiest women, with her mom and sisters right alongside her. She had a website and a personal blog where she gave visitors and readers a peek into her private world of privilege and wealth. But she ended up shutting it down, and it's been said it became too popular. And what that meant, I don't really know, but the speculation is that her family had some say about it, especially considering all the scandal that would erupt later on with her father and her brother. But she had a solid fan base and a following, so a new website was dedicated to her and launched shortly after she shut it down. While Yoon lived in Korea, she was escorted by no less than 2 bodyguards around the clock. In New York, she had an around-the-clock on-call driver that took her everywhere she needed to go by limo. She had arrived just 3 months before her death in September of 2005 and enrolled at NYU, with the hopes of one day leading Samsung's cultural foundation. She had already acquired a remarkable personal collection of art on her own. But what everyone saw in Yoon from the outside looking in was very different than what she seemed to be hiding just beneath the surface. The doorman at the apartment she lived in said to the media that there were times when she just would not emerge from her apartment for maybe a week or more at a time. An unnamed source close to Yoon or the Samsung family had the impression that she was either lonely, depressed, or both, especially from the time she began living in New York. And the reason for this is because the move caused her to be separated from her boyfriend, who still lived back in South Korea. She was very much in love with him and wanted to marry him, but as a result of her parents' disapproval due to the fact that he was in a very, very different social class than she was, it led to the end of their relationship. Yoon was left devastated and emotionally tormented by the breakup. Being the youngest child of the chairman of the most prominent and influential family in South Korea, they simply would not have it. Coming to terms with the fact that he was never going to be accepted by Yoon's family, the person that she wanted to marry, a man named Shin Subin, did what he believed was right, to honor the wishes of her family and gracefully and quietly bowed out of the relationship. The breakup occurred just prior to Yoon's move to New York, and it was actually Shin and a friend of his who were visiting her from South Korea that were the ones to discover Yoon hanging from behind a door inside her apartment at about 3 a.m. They immediately called for help, but there was nothing that could be done. Yoon left no note. The New York Post reported that Yoon had moved to New York sight unseen, so I can only imagine what a shock to her system and her senses it was to be in a city like that, especially since she went without ever having visited before. Those who knew Yoon said that the person she was before she arrived in New York changed right away, and not for the better. However, her international studies professor remarked that at first, Yoon was very enthusiastic about her studies and had an immeasurable amount of passion for the arts. There was a museum in Korea where the family's art collection is housed, and its entire concept and model, Yoon was the one who developed it. But she still wanted to further her studies and earn her master's and take that with her when she returned to head the museum. It was important for her to establish herself as a fully accomplished and qualified person in her own right, without it all being because she was an heiress to the richest, most powerful family in South Korea. One woman who met Yoon at the Dia Art Foundation in New York said that she was beautiful, eager, and carried a Louis Vuitton that nobody else in the world had. And all she wanted was for everyone to like her. And I want all of us to keep Yoon in mind as we go through this story and remember what life really is like for an heiress to the Samsung family fortune. And I know this is somewhat off topic, and I thought that it was pretty interesting when I began looking into the Samsung family, which I had not previously done before researching this. The one thing that the New York Post said about Lee Yoon-hung is that she was the Paris Hilton of South Korea. Interestingly enough, that would be the exact title the subject at the center of our story would give herself here today. Lisette Lee was the self-proclaimed Paris Hilton of South Korea. But if you look at pictures of Yoon and then you look at pictures of Lisette, you can kind of see where the real social status is, where the Samsung family really had its influence. Lisette Lee has been called a lot of things over the years since she gained her notoriety. For the title of this episode, I called her the drug Queenpin of Beverly Hills, which is a blend of the various things the media has dubbed her as. Aside from being the Paris Hilton of South Korea, she's been called the Pot Princess of Beverly Hills. Rolling Stone called her the Gangster Princess of Beverly Hills. There's all sorts of catchy little names and titles. On top of that, Lisette has made the claim that not only was she the granddaughter of the Samsung founder on her mother's side, but her father was just as wealthy and influential over in Japan. A relative of the co-founder of Sony, Akio Morita. And you know Sony, they came out with the very first commercial VCR in 1975 with their Betamax format. However, 2 years later, JVC introduced their version of the VCR and introduced the world to the VHS format, and that eventually sank Sony's Betamax by 1988, at which time they too shifted to the VHS as well. And aside from that, Sony today is a global conglomerate headquartered in Tokyo. Their business includes electronics, gaming, and entertainment. Sony owns the largest music entertainment business and video game console, the PlayStation, and is one of the largest video game publishing companies in the world. They are also in the film and television industry, in all ranking 97th on Forbes Fortune Global 500. So you kind of get a sense of what Lisette was going for here when she decided who she wanted to be. Now, what made this combination of her lineage somewhat taboo is the fact that Samsung is a South Korean company, while Sony is a Japanese company. The union of her mother and father, well, it is a forbidden love, something that neither family would be accepting of. And because she was a product of this interracial relationship, she was an outcast, or she would have been an outcast on both sides of her family. Now, Lisette did have money. Was it Samsung/Sony levels of money? Perhaps. But she had enough to at least play the part. She had designer clothes, designer handbags, a yappy little chihuahua, and a very, very well-dressed entourage that included at least one huge bodyguard, associates of various sorts, and 2 personal assistants. All of it under the guise of being an heiress to a family fortune. She cast herself as many things, but mostly she said she was a model, a singer, a socialite, and an heiress. She made her way around town in limousines and fur coats. She barked orders at her entourage while she had her little barky dog in tow. She told people she went to a fancy prep school in LA, the same one that Paris Hilton apparently attended. As both Lisette and Paris were born in 1981, so they'd be in the same grade. In Los Angeles, Paris Hilton attended the Buckley School and St. Paul the Apostle School, and then attended 1 year of high school at the Marywood Palm Valley School in Rancho Mirage, California. But when she was 15, she moved to the East Coast, where she attended Professional Children's School. And then she spent 1 year at Provo Canyon School for emotionally troubled youth. Then Paris went to Dwight School, but eventually dropped out and earned her GED. All of the schools that Paris attended were private college prep schools, with the exception of the Provo Canyon School for Troubled Teens in Utah. Paris had trouble fitting in, and apparently Lisette Lee, along with her other socialites in the class, were the ones to have claimed to have shunned Paris, not allowing her to be a part of their elite squad. Following her graduation from high school, Lisette said she attended Harvard University, and after that, she attended finishing school in London, which is why she to this day speaks with a British intonation. Now, after that, Lisette was ready to embark upon her full-time occupation as a socialite and an heiress. She said she rubbed elbows with some of the most elite social circles in Los Angeles, and at one time had dated actors Leonardo DiCaprio and Channing Tatum. Lisette very much played the part. Everywhere she went, she had her Chanel bag, her designer clothes, her high heels clicking everywhere she walked. She batted her fake eyelashes, and she verbally abused everybody in her path, from her staff to her bodyguards to her assistants and everybody in between. Everyone was her servant. She referred to her friends as her army of skanks. She called one of her assistants, who I will introduce you to a little bit later on, as her desperate little whore. I even read one article that said that the mole on Lisette's face was a fraud too. That being said, it is telling and worth remembering how every single detail of Lisette's identity was important to keep up with, because she was constantly putting on the Lisette Lee show. And all of this, her entire glamorous, swanky lifestyle, was being bankrolled by at least one, possibly both sides of her family. And she says they are Sony and Samsung. Lisette claimed that just as Paris Hilton and Kim Kardashian, who Lisette regularly referred to as that fat Armenian, she was out in the world attempting to blaze a trail of her own, to create a brand uniquely hers in order to distance herself somewhat from both sides of her extremely wealthy family. Some of her ventures included modeling for Vogue magazine, being a K-pop singer back home in Korea. She dabbled in acting, but it would eventually be a chance meeting with a man named David Garrett that would take Lisette's career into a completely different direction: drug trafficking. I first want to go through what Lisette, the self-proclaimed Korean Paris Hilton, was up to leading up to that point. First and foremost, nearly everything about Lisette Lee, almost everything, was a lie. And what is thought to possibly or most likely be the truth would trickle out later on. But because of all the lies, it's somewhat of a mystery anyway. You see, Lisette did have money. She had really nice clothes and she had really nice cars. This wasn't like the story we heard out of New York within the last couple years, that fake heiress, Anna Delvey. She ran her scams using other people's money and lines of credit and took it to a point where she simply could not keep it going any longer because she had burned everybody around her until there was nobody left to burn. And that's kind of an interesting story. Maybe we could do a bonus about her. She did a lot of damage to a lot of people's lives, financial damage that is probably continuing to have a ripple effect long after Anna Delvey is forgotten. But no, this isn't the case here with Lisette. She had money, and she had a privileged life. She did, in fact, move from South Korea. She settled in Beverly Hills. It's been said that she was adopted, and that's where she ended up, and that the reason she was adopted out was because of her mixed heritage of being both Korean and Japanese. But from very early on, it was clear that Lisette became quite adept of being somewhat of a chameleon, and this might stem from having issues with identity. She had an ability of going from one persona to another in order to fit in, but more importantly, to be able to manipulate the people that she surrounded herself with. And this is where her story of being an heiress to the Samsung family fortune would develop, and she would use that. She had all the money and the props, the cars, the clothes, the purses, the dogs, the looks, and pretty much everything to sell that story. And nobody was going to question it. And on top of that, she comes off as pretty intelligent and well-spoken. In the documentary I watched in this case, there are some excerpts of a letter that she wrote to a judge. And even though I call a lot of BS all over the place, it was well written. And she will have a written response to the article about her that was published in Rolling Stone in 2012. which I will refer to several times throughout the telling of this case. There are many puzzling things about Lisette beyond just her identity, but the reasons why she did what she did, what drove her, what motivated her, what she was about, where she was from, what her name really was, even her age. Everything about Lisette has left those who knew her and those who've only heard of her wondering. Because these weren't little white lies. These were outrageously elaborate, complex lies. And with that, the truth of it all and what was real and what was made up and who this woman truly was got lost somewhere in the intricate labyrinth of her world. And even when the world that Lisette built started to show some cracks, and the truth as to what she was involved in on a criminal level began to surface, in many ways, it made everything even murkier than ever. But it all came crashing down, to an extent, in June of 2010, on the runway of an airport in Columbus, Ohio. Now, as I said, Rolling Stone has a really great article about this story from back in August of 2012, and it's entitled The Gangster Princess of Beverly Hills, written by Sabrina Rubin Ederle. She also appeared in the documentary that's on YouTube. I'm going to refer to her article. She has spoken to a number of people involved in this case, including directly to Lisette Lee. Federal agents were waiting for Lisette in full force when she landed at the Ohio airport for the 14th time in a span of about 8 months. The Drug Enforcement Agency caught wind that Lisette, along with the cast of characters that she called her entourage, had been making unusually frequent trips by way of private jet from Southern California to Ohio. Lisette had a variety of stories about who she was, what the nature of the trip was for, and why she had so much heavy luggage, and a staff of about a half dozen or so who catered to her every demand. She was a model headed to Ohio for a photo shoot. She was a Korean pop star headed to Ohio to shoot a music video. She was an heiress headed to Ohio to get away from the glitz of Beverly Hills and a taste of the simple life. But when she got off that Gulfstream jet that she had chartered for about $50,000 and climbed into her waiting Cadillac Escalade, she and her entourage found themselves surrounded by the feds. And Lisette was pissed. She demanded to know what was going on as she got out of her car and marched right towards all those agents with their guns pointed right at her. She did not even bat a fake eyelash. As everyone else who had accompanied her were in their assigned vehicles, they slowly began to put it together that the jig was up. They were caught, and they weren't about to come out stomping out of their cars, demanding to know what was going on. They knew, and they weren't about to have a showdown with the heavily armed feds. They listened to the commands, they moved slowly, they put their hands up, and surrendered. These DEA agents believed that they were dealing with a group of individuals cut straight out of a movie. They had Lisette there, all glammed up, full makeup, designer everything, very loud and very much in command of it all. At least all the way up until the point that she realized that she wasn't going to be able to diva her way out of this particular face-off with the DEA. They also had a very large man named Frank Edwards. He was all of 6'9" or 2.06 meters tall, and at least 300 pounds or 136 kilograms. He played the role of bodyguard. There was another guy who was seen kissing Lisette, and it wasn't the guy who I mentioned earlier who had gotten Lisette started into all this business, David Garrett. No, they had had a falling out a couple months back. Their breakup was a result of a combination of things which I'll get into, but I'll just say it right now, Lisette was not the type of person that was settling down with one boyfriend or love interest at a time. Lisette always had several men from what I could see, and they all served a purpose. It is essentially how most of these people would get dragged into this world that they may otherwise have never been a part of. There was a guy named Christopher Cash. She was romantic with him, and he traveled as her assistant/boyfriend. There was another man with this group named Henry Hernandez. She was his doorman at the building that she lived in Beverly Hills. She was also romantically involved with him. He was a part of her staff as well. She also had a woman she befriended named Miley Caddy. Miley had actually been pretty outspoken about her role in the story. She's done interviews and she's even written a book about it. She moved to California to pursue a career in acting from a small town in Washington state. So she has sort of cast herself as a naive young 19-year-old who got swept up by Lisette and her glamorous life. Lisette had quickly befriended her, telling Miley that she was tired of her rich friends. But before long, Miley was hired on as Lisette's personal assistant, and she too was among the group being detained in Columbus. I'll tell you more about Miley and the rest of these people as the story progresses. So by the time Lisette and her entourage landed this 14th time, federal DEA agents had been tipped off, and they were way ahead of time to sit there and not only watch, but to record them on video as they quickly tried to get the obviously extremely heavy luggage off the plane and into their rented vehicles. And when they approached Lisette and identified themselves as the DEA, she clearly had zero patience for their questions. She snapped right away with the "how dare you," that she was delivering supplies to a farm that bred horses. However, that story would evolve several times as Lisette did what she could to dodge responsibility for what was really going on here. After being taken into custody and subjected to further questioning, Lisette offered up another version of what she was doing. She was given about $60,000 to cover the cost of making this trip from Columbus to California, but she had no idea what she was carrying in those suitcases. It wasn't her job to ask the questions. She just did what she was paid to do. But she suspected that there might be something illegal going on. She thought perhaps it had to do with transporting guns or large sums of money. She was on a need-to-know basis, and she did not need to know. Lisette also spun her usual story that she had been for quite some time leading up to this point, telling the DEA agents during questioning that she was in fact a very famous pop star in Korea, but she was also a member of Korea's wealthiest, most prominent families, that her grandfather was the founder of Samsung, and she was an heiress to that fortune. Whether or not the agents believed her, well, on their paperwork, once it was filed, they indeed listed Lisette's career as heiress. She had insisted she is of the Samsung Lee family fortune. And as I mentioned previously, she did have the money to sell the story, and she did act like a pampered little rich girl. She drove not one but two Bentleys, an Aston Martin, a Mercedes-Benz. She carried her little Chihuahua with her everywhere she went. She had her little crew of servants that she constantly snapped and talked down to. But it was quickly becoming clear that even if Lisette was all of the things that she said she was, it really didn't take a drug-sniffing canine to be able to pick up the scent of marijuana wafting through the air to know that she was involved in a pretty large-scale drug trafficking ring. According to the article in Rolling Stone, the dozen or so suitcases that Lisette was traveling with, and these weren't just regular old suitcases that you get at Target or at Ross. Each one of these was a designer bag, a Louis Vuitton, a Gucci, a Chanel, and in all they contained about 500 pounds or 225 kilograms of marijuana in tightly wrapped bricks. And in the crocodile purse that Lisette was carrying, she had with her more than $6,000 in cash, 3 phones, a small baggie of cocaine, and a notepad with some weights and prices, which added up to $300,000. And just out of curiosity, I looked up crocodile purses, which I have never looked into before. And in 2014, Louis Vuitton in fact debuted its most expensive crocodile handbag, costing about $55,000. Despite animal rights activists, and as of last year, at least California, I don't know about any other states, has banned exotic animal hide products, including fur and alligator and crocodile products. Louis Vuitton still has a large selection of those items on their website. including a crocodile backpack that costs $84,000. And as I mentioned before, this would be the last of 14 trips that Lisette made in a matter of about 8 months, starting in October of 2009. This final one being in June of 2010. Before anyone caught on or reported what she and her crew were up to, it's believed that she transported about 7,000 pounds or 3,175 kilograms of marijuana, earning for herself a profit of about $3 million. That was her profit, and with that she paid her staff. And the reason why it is believed that Lisette was able to get away with it as long as she did was because she used the smokescreen of her wealthy heiress socialite persona to hide behind. Because it was so glitzy and glamorous, she presented herself as some sort of royalty, and nobody really questioned what she was doing, at least for a while. The smell of marijuana was obvious. They tried to camouflage the odor with Febreze and dryer sheets, but nothing was really going to be able to mask that smell. And the companies from which Lisette was chartering these private jets, they themselves are at risk of getting in a lot of trouble too. Eventually, it's just not worth it. So the DEA was tipped off leading up to this last trip in June of 2010. They had used the same chartering company. At times, they had the same pilot. And they began to wonder, how many times is this woman gonna move to Ohio? It was a pretty audacious operation on Lisette's part. And as befuddled as the agents were to be confronted with the indignant attitude of Lisette, Lisette herself was just as bewildered when she was told she was being taken into custody. Agents even having reported that the first thing she asked was what she was going to wear in jail. So I want to tell you a little bit more about Miley Caddy, the young woman who got swept up into Lisette's jet-setting lifestyle. The women met in 2006 and became fast friends. Lisette told Miley her usual backstory, that she was the granddaughter of Samsung founder, that she was practically royalty in South Korea, that she was a model, pop star, and she had once dated Leonardo DiCaprio and Channing Tatum, blah, blah, blah. But the one thing that Miley picked up on early was the fact that Lisette had a quick and sharp temper. She'd snap and yell at anybody in her path, but then, at the drop of a hat, the iciness would thaw, and she could be just as quickly to warm back up to you, making you feel like the most loved and important person in the world. And that's how she kept people close and obedient. And the key to that involved Lisette making everyone around her believe that she was the biggest and baddest person in the room. She had to dominate. That way, nobody would question anything. Lisette took a liking to Miley right away, and the feeling was very mutual. It wasn't long before Lisette told her, "We are going to be the best of friends." And that sounded great to Miley, who found herself now hanging out in a $1 million Beverly Hills apartment. Of course, she wasn't sure how or why she could possibly measure up to being Lisette's BFF. They were from two completely different worlds. Miley had dreams of becoming an actress, which is what brought her to Southern California. But she still was very much an average, small-town girl from the Pacific Northwest. Lisette told her she was exactly the kind of change that she needed in her life, that Miley was a breath of fresh air. And with a string of auditions that had gotten her nowhere, Miley was very much in need of a friend. The big city had been getting to her. Lisette and Miley were introduced through a mutual friend. Miley had been skeptical at first because she didn't really think that they had anything in common. But Lisette met her with a friendly embrace, and with that, Miley's apprehensions melted away. They walked around West Hollywood, they perused some of the stores, they talked like they'd known each other for years. Lisette told Miley that she was in a relationship with a man named Christian Navarro, a famous wine curator who worked exclusively with the rich and famous. There are pictures of Lisette with Christian, and they did indeed have a relationship, possibly having plans to get married. If you look up Christian now, you have to search for Christian Navarro wine because there is another famous Christian Navarro who played Tony Padilla in the Netflix series 13 Reasons. So he comes up as the top searches these days. Lisette also gave Miley the rundown of who she was, the whole spiel: Samsung, Sony, casinos, prep school, Paris Hilton, Harvard, finishing school, etc. And in short order, Miley and Lisette were the best of friends. They spent so much time together, just the two of them, hanging out in Lisette's swanky apartment. And when they hung out, it was mandatory that they focused on being present and in the moment. No phones, no music, no TV. And in some ways, all of this was part of Lisette's manipulation. She wanted your undivided attention. And for somebody like Miley, it felt really good to be the center of Lisette's world. It was so easy and comfortable and safe. It was all so fun and happy and silly, and they giggled and laughed for hours into the night. And Lisette developed such a strong attachment and affection for Miley, and the feeling was mutual. Miley was sold, hook, line, and sinker. Now, as much as we know of Lisette being a fake and a fraud and a liar about many things, there is kind of a part of me that believes that this relationship with Miley was somewhat genuine, as it happened at least 3 years before the women got swept up into the drug trafficking mess. Whatever or whomever Lisette Lee was, I wouldn't be surprised that her existence was incredibly lonely. Everyone around her was in her life based on a lie, and everyone was friends with her because they thought that she was someone that she was not. And even though she had wealth, they were still friendships and relationships based on something that wasn't real. And maybe Miley, in a way, was a departure from that. Being from a small town in the Pacific Northwest, it doesn't get more down to earth than that. And Miley, even though she said that she may have been swept away by Lisette's allure, it was probably one of the more genuine relationships that Lisette ever had, at least on Miley's part. Miley didn't seem to have any other motive other than to just be friends. Yeah, there was the money, there was the wealth, it was fun and exciting to be a part of that, but I tend to think Miley would have been friends with Lisette even if she didn't come with all the bells and whistles. Of course, today, after all this is said and done, everything that Miley went through as a result of her relationship with Lisette, she'll quickly say that she was duped and completely fooled. And the whole foundation of their friendship was built on the premise of them having been so different, having come from such different backgrounds. She would tell Miley how different she was than everyone else she associated with. Miley was such a sweet and kind person, but also pretty intelligent. Lisette appreciated the fact that even though everyone thought that she was a nasty, spoiled, rotten, unpleasant person, that Miley was able to see the kind and thoughtful person that she really was. Miley didn't fake anything. Everything about her was pretty genuine. It's what you see is what you get, and she felt like Lisette appreciated that about her. Just prior to becoming friends with Miley in 2006, Lisette had actually managed to saunter her way onto some low-budget movie set, a film called The Doorman. I looked it up on IMDb, and sure enough, Lisette is listed there in the credits, her character title being Baby Sugar Mama. Though the Rolling Stone article said that this was a cameo as herself, Lisette Lee, model/socialite. In the plot summary it says, New York City's most famous and powerful nightclub gatekeeper, Trevor W., has somehow managed to lose his job at the door, but can't shake the documentary film crew following him. Trevor will play tour guide on his awkward journey down to earth as he comes to terms with his ego, identity, and career options. According to Rolling Stone, Lisette arrived at the set as her full-blown self. Everyone was murmuring under their breath, "That's the Samsung Heiress." She had on her fur coat, she had her gigantic bodyguard that I told you about earlier. Her scene in the movie was her going to look at new cars at a Mercedes-Benz dealership, and then going shopping in Beverly Hills, and then going to see her wine connoisseur boyfriend, played by her apparently real-life wine connoisseur boyfriend, Christian Navarro. And this would be where an actor named Scott Cooper caught Lisette's attention. He had a small part in the film, but when they were done working for the day, Lisette told her bodyguard to head on home without her. And I guess Christian had also gone home for the day as well, because she cozied up with Scott. They wound up in bed together in the home in which portions of the movie were being filmed, but Scott does say that the two of them never had sex. To me, it's just a testament to Lisette's ability to get whatever she wants, when she wants it, and everyone just seems to cater to her, because they think that she's the Samsung granddaughter. In an interview with a documentary on this case, Scott, who was about 10 years older than Lisette, said that on top of the manner in which she carried herself, she did have an extremely high tolerance for drinking and drugs, which at times made for an even more volatile Lisette Lee. He said she could outdrink and outdrug everybody around her like it didn't even faze her. And Scott was many of the men who fell very hard for Lisette's beauty, and of course, it didn't hurt that she was filthy rich. But Lisette often targeted men like Scott, men who were just regular, everyday working guys. The kind of guys that an heiress wouldn't normally give the time of day to were getting the time of day given to them by Lisette. How serious her relationship with Christian Navarro was clearly wasn't all that serious to her, but honestly, I don't know how long Lisette's lies would hold up with somebody who had a measure of wealth and social status in their own right. Like Lisette has said, she dated Leonardo DiCaprio and Channing Tatum. There is no truth to that, but I'm pretty sure that her lies wouldn't fly with the real rich and famous. Lisette is called a lot of things, and among them, she's been referred to as a tease. And I'm putting it nicely because others have put the C word in front of that, which I don't really like saying. But she had a way with men like Scott. She was able to make them feel special and important. And she also had not a problem dropping them just as quickly without warning. Lisette told Scott she supported herself solely through her connection through Samsung. And sometime in the near future, she said that she would be able to help find him an excellent paying job within her family's company. There was just something about Lisette that not only had men mesmerized by who she was, or at least who she said she was, but she was also able to make demands and for those demands to be met. She was able to bark orders and those orders would be followed. Scott recalled an incident with the Rolling Stone article where he had a connection with a sort of well-known record producer. This guy's biggest claim to fame up to that point was having worked with R&B recording artist Aaron Neville. But it wasn't that Lisette was there to meet him necessarily. It seemed as though everyone was there to meet her since, she's an international model and Korean pop star that has had several hits on the Asian music charts, so she says. As she made her way into the room with a group of people, she quickly zeroed in on a large black man amidst the crowd, himself an up-and-coming rap artist. Her eyes stopped on him immediately. She looked him up and down, she threw her car keys at him, and demanded that he go park her car, calling him the N-word while she was at it. A stunned silence fell over the room until everyone in unison just started laughing. Lisette remained stoic and stone-faced, and didn't hardly even flinch as everyone around her found the moment to be utterly hilarious. But here's the thing. If anyone was bothering to do the math, the things that Lisette was saying were not adding up. She had claimed to have gone to the same prep school as Paris Hilton. But one person she encountered who also attended the same prep school didn't remember Lisette. But he sort of just let it slide. I mean, did it really matter in the end? And how old Lisette actually was at the time was also slippery. She would have been about 25 in real life, But like I had said, nobody really knows anything other than that she was born in 1981. However, she was going around telling everybody she was 21. That right there would have aged her out of having been in the same grade as Paris Hilton. But again, nobody was walking around with a calculator calling Lisette out on it. This was 2006, 2007 would come and go, then 2008, and eventually 2009. And here is Lisette telling people she's 22. So that would amount to 3 regular people years was equal to 1 Lisette Lee year. She also sometimes spoke with a British lilt to her accent. That would be from her time in finishing school, of course, in London, where she lived with her mummy. And is Lisette Lee even her real name? I am not sure. Though lots of people who immigrate to the United States from Asia, they usually take on, sometimes not all, but they take on a traditional American name. And Lisette may have been what she chose or settled on or was chosen for her. As for her last name, Lee, it is listed as likely being the most common surname on the planet, with upwards of over 100 million people who share that last name, with it being spelled L-E-E in Korea, L-I in China, and L-Y in Vietnam. But as a child being raised in Beverly Hills, she first took on the name Diana. Yes, as in Princess Diana. But as a youngster, she found herself to be quite underwhelming. She seemed to be bright in school, but either she was unable or unwilling to meet the expectations that were set for her, or perhaps what she aspired to. Rolling Stone called her an underachiever. I think that's putting it nicely, if you ask me. Considering all we know about Lisette as an adult, she told people she was a model, a pop star, an heiress. But if she doesn't actually ever become any of those things, do we label that as underachieving? Well, she's going around saying that she is those things, but she's not. So we call it lying. And I want to kind of sidetrack and sort of compare this to the college admission scandals that have come to light over the last year. Most notably in the news lately is actress Lori Loughlin, who along with her husband allegedly paid some pretty hefty bribes and faked some pictures of their daughters participating in rowing activities in order to gain admissions into USC with the intentions of becoming a part of the women's rowing team, which neither of their daughters ever did, nor did they ever have any intentions of doing so. So we have Lori Loughlin's 2 daughters, right? Their parents are filthy rich, mom being an actress, dad is a fashion designer, and these girls have a pretty pampered existence. They really don't have to work or want for much of anything. Though both of them seem to have a strong online presence and a following, one of them more so than the other, and they use their social media sites to post about fashion and makeup and hair and, the usual stuff these celebrity kids like to do. And it can turn into something quite lucrative as they go along. They're making money. However, their parents have aspirations of them going to arguably one of the most prestigious private colleges in the United States, USC. But were their girls USC material? It doesn't exactly sound like they were. As a matter of fact, at least one of Lori's girls kind of poo-pooed on the idea of going to college, expressing a strong disinterest in pursuing higher education. But through their parents, they circumvented the admissions process and got in the easy way, with money and lies. But we don't call them underachievers. I think the girls were achieving exactly what they wanted to and what they were capable of. We call them fakers and liars. And that's kind of how I see Lisette Lee. Even back when she was in school, even though she, like the Loughlin girls, may have had the beauty and the money to fake it till she made it, I don't think there was this sense of underachievement because none of them did well in school. The truth is, they wanted everything handed to them while exerting as little effort as possible. And to me, that translates to part laziness, part entitlement. I find Lisette to be a lazy adult wanting the fame and fortune and notoriety without having to do anything more than say that she was rich and famous. And the Laughlin girls, their mom wanted the prestige of her daughters attending a school like USC without having to do any more than just say that they go to USC. But anyway, that's the long explanation of why I don't see Lisette as an underachiever. She actually worked really hard at her lies, so let's give credit where credit is due, I guess. But anyway, Lisette ditched the name Diana after it didn't seem to be working hard enough for her. So at some point in her teen years, she started going by the name Chantel. But eventually, she settled on Lee Locascio Lee, which seemed to give her a sort of silky, pseudo-ethnic sound. But you know how sometimes when you get into the modeling business, because most of us know exactly what that's all about, right? Right. So Lisette began saying that her quote-unquote modeling name was Lisette Locascio. However, when she would make appearances at various glitzy Hollywood events, she called herself Lisette Lee Morita. Morita is the surname of the Sony co-founder, and it is the actual last name of her biological father. And this seemed to be the incarnation of her name that she wanted to stick with, so she even went out and had a fake ID made in order to continue passing herself off as Lisette Morita. The address she had on it would have made her neighbors with the likes of Jennifer Aniston, Beyonce, Jay-Z, Elon Musk, the Fresh Prince himself. Yeah, when she ordered her fake ID, she listed her address as being in Bel Air. Incidentally, the fake ID garnered the Fresh Princess of Bel Air an arrest and conviction in 2006 for forgery. According to Miley, Lisette told her that Morita was her father's surname, and he was some sort of Japanese mobster that made his fortune in the casino business. Although, looking back on the 4 years that Miley was friends with Lisette, hindsight now making it clear why her stories never made a whole lot of sense, some of it having been really over-the-top outlandish, since Lisette was masterful at the art of the spin. She was clever, and she was skilled, and it was all over everybody's head. They didn't question because Lisette didn't allow it. To Miley, when you stripped away the designer clothes, the money, the stories, Lisette had always come back to one thing: that despite it all, her life, her story, was tragically unhappy. Miley got the feeling that she was filling a much-needed void in Lisette's life. At least that's how she was made to feel. Now, don't forget that despite all of the things that Lisette is saying, there are shades of truth in this, which will come out later on. A part of why Lisette was so unhappy was because she made no secret of the fact that she was in a relationship with Christian Navarro and they didn't get along. He seemed to be a good match for her. He was wealthy and successful, but they bickered incessantly. She shared these feelings with Scott Cooper, that actor that she met, after they became involved in that movie cameo she made. And as for Christian, he actually thought that there were two things working against him. The fact that he was almost 20 years older than Lisette, and he also thought that she was way richer than he was. Today, Christian is still considered to be the wine guru to the stars. I looked at his website, and his most expensive bottle of wine is some 1945 French red Bordeaux blend for $33,000. So Lisette even had him thinking that she had way more wealth than he ever would, and that she made much more money than he could ever earn, and that he simply wasn't going to be able to make her happy. Though he tried, and according to Rolling Stone, A part of his efforts included coughing up a $200,000 down payment for one of Lisette's Bentleys. Another thing that Lisette was constantly bothered with, or said that she was bothered with, was work. Wait, what, work? Yeah, work. She said that she had to go to Samsung meetings. And not only did her parents make her attend these periodic meetings, they also insisted on employing a bodyguard to keep watch over her 24/7 while they themselves tried to control Lisette's life as much as possible. And that's why she needed to live apart from the family home in Bel Air and be in her own $1 million apartment in Beverly Hills. She just couldn't take the overprotectiveness and the controllingness of her parents. Lisette took Miley to her family's home in Bel Air one time, but she said that there was no way they could go in, but they could drive by. Driving through the wide, winding streets lined with gated mansions, Lisette finally parked her Bentley in front of one of the homes, rolled down her window, and waved hello to the outdoor surveillance cameras. And with impeccable timing, her phone rang. It was one of her family's staff wondering why she was parked outside. She kept her family separate from her friends. They were just way too dysfunctional to bring anybody around them. Over time, Miley's relationship with Lisette began to change. Everyone that wanted to be around Lisette came to understand that the only way things were going to work, whether they were a friend, a boyfriend, a bodyguard, or whatever, they had to remain subservient to her. They had to stay in line, and most importantly, Lisette only mingled amongst people who knew who she was. She wasn't going to show up at any Hollywood party unless the host knew exactly who she was and would be treating her accordingly. So, needless to say, she wasn't exactly really a staple in the Hollywood party circuit because she really wasn't well known or famous beyond the handful of loyal devotees that she used to create the illusion of status and importance. The real who's who in Hollywood would have no idea who Lisette Lee was. She knew it, so she stayed away. As for Miley, she began to start to feel as though she was more like the help and Lisette as her boss. Eventually, this role would morph into an official job as Lisette's personal assistant, at which point Miley would have to wear professional attire. And for some reason, I picture Miley walking around with a clipboard or a notebook, taking notes as Lisette barked out her demands. But Lisette started treating Miley in a way that was meant to humiliate her, especially in front of other people. She regularly introduced Miley as her desperate little whore. She even gave Miley a diamond ring, demanding that she wear it as an engagement ring, meant to be a symbol of Miley's loyalty to Lisette. Miley eventually began seeing someone, but Lisette regularly interfered, often making her postpone her plans so she would have to cater to Lisette. She would snoop on Miley's phone, and it really turned into a strange relationship. And the only thing that really made sense to me was that Lisette knew that her facade was thin. In order for the life that she was fabricating for herself to continue to hold up, was if the supporting characters stayed in their roles. She needed everyone around her to stay the course. And here goes Miley getting involved in a romantic relationship of her own. Lisette knew that that was going to take more and more of Miley's time away from being her personal servant, so she had to keep a hold on Miley, hence the expensive diamond ring. But it wasn't just limited to keeping control of Miley's time, but also that actor that she had met on the set of The Doorman, Scott Cooper. He was desperately in love with Lisette. And I mean, she never even gave him any more than a bit of her time, just enough to keep him hooked, but not enough where she would actually become intimate with him or even entertain the idea of being in any sort of committed relationship with him. Like everyone else, she strung Scott along, just another person in her inner circle to worship the ground that she walked on. And to make things worse, There was also a level of embarrassment and public humiliation that Lisette used to solidify her manipulation of the people around her. According to the Rolling Stone article, Lisette had made this arrangement for Scott to run into her and her boyfriend Christian Navarro while they were having dinner at a swanky West Hollywood restaurant in order to get both men jealous. Scott also told Rolling Stone that there was a time when he, Lisette, and Miley were playing a game of truth or dare, and Lisette dared him and Miley to make out. And for him, the whole thing came from a very mean and vindictive place, as Lisette knew that he had long been wanting to be with her. But here he was, kissing Miley instead, purely for Lisette's amusement. They did the dare. I don't think that Miley or Scott felt like they had a choice, even if this was only a game. Then came one fateful evening in 2009. Scott Cooper was living with that record producer I had mentioned earlier who had worked with Aaron Neville. His name was Bradley Spalter. You don't really have to remember him, but there was this party at his place, and this is where Scott was living at the time that he was pining over Lisette, which by this time had been going on for about 3 years. Well, at this party was a guy named David Garrett. He was really just someone that Scott knew sort of casually. If anything, Scott got his drugs from David, who, according to Rolling Stone, is described as this Hispanic guy, somewhat of a thug, covered up to his neck in tattoos, but generally a pretty relaxed and mellow guy who was just there to enjoy the party. Well, there was something about him that caught Lisette's attention. And just like that, she's got somebody new that she wanted to make a part of her close inner circle of acquaintances. Before the night was over, Lisette and David were getting pretty hot and heavy, all right there in front of Scott, the one who had been lovesick over her for the better part of 3 years. When she eventually spotted Scott, she tossed him a $100 bill and demanded that he bring her a bottle of Grey Goose. When he came back, Lisette and David had migrated to a bedroom for some privacy. Scott gave her the vodka. She snapped at him to keep the change and slammed the door. Whatever Scott thought that he might have had with Lisette was gone. After a few weeks of wallowing in his own self-pity, frustrated and angry that he had been played for years only to have that happen in his own home right in front of him with this guy, David Garrett, who he considered to be nothing more than a criminal, drug-dealing street thug, Scott just could not believe that Lisette would even go there. Someone of her wealth and social status, he couldn't get past that. So after a couple weeks had passed, Scott had a verbal confrontation with Lisette, yelling at her that he couldn't believe that she would get together with somebody like David. He followed that up with a threat to send an email to her family's company, Samsung, and tell them exactly what she was doing, with whom their granddaughter was getting involved with, the garbage that she was associating herself with. Not too long after Scott had made that confrontation and the threat to spill the beans to her family, he found himself in a world of trouble. After Lisette began a relationship with David Garrett, Scott decided that the best thing for him would be to put some distance between himself, Lisette, and Los Angeles, so he moved to New York. He began putting together an idea for a clothing line business that he wanted to launch, but he needed some capital from an investor with money who might be interested in helping. So he reached out to Lisette and asked if she would be interested. She called him back and she told him that she would give him the money that he needed. Just go ahead and fly back to California and come see her. When he did fly back, Lisette had sent a black Cadillac Escalade to pick him up from the airport. When he got into the back seat, he was driven a short distance before the vehicle came to a stop and picked up two men, getting into the Escalade on either side of Scott in the back seat. They put him in a headlock, and they roughed him up while the driver was talking on the phone, presumably to Lisette, telling her, "Yes, we got the package, boss. Yes, boss, we got it." The driver hung up the phone and turned around and said to Scott, "You know what, my friend? This is your lucky day. I'm going to go against my boss's orders and let you live." The vehicle pulled over in the hills near a cliff that overlooked the city. He was robbed of his Rolex, his wallet, and his shoes before leaving him on the roadside, bloodied, bruised, but alive. Later on that evening, Scott received a message from Lisette that said, "Nobody talks to me like that." Scott filed a police report about the incident and the threat to his life, and that he believed it to be Lisette Lee that ordered the attack, and she did it likely with the help of her new boyfriend, David Garrett. Of course, Lisette denied any involvement, and according to the Rolling Stone article, she said, "Anything that comes out of that pie hole is seriously damaged." According to Rubin's article in Rolling Stone, David Garrett has claimed from the beginning that the relationship with Lisette was sexual. He had come from a single-parent home, working class. His mom was a cashier at a grocery store. He had attended Culver City High School, but ended up dropping out. Later on, he earned his GED, so with at least that, he could try and find work. For a brief period of time, he worked at Home Depot, but that didn't last long, and he soon discovered that he could make way more money for a lot less work and time selling drugs. And that's pretty much what he'd been doing when he suddenly crossed paths with Lisette Lee, heiress to the Samsung Electronics fortune. They began dating, and obviously for somebody like him, just a small-time drug dealer, to be in a relationship with somebody like her, he really wanted to win her over and impress her. He worked very hard at it. And the one thing that he would actually be able to impress Lisette with would be the drugs. He could see right away that there was something about the possibility of taking his small-time drug dealing to the next level, which would be big-time drug trafficking, and that Lisette immediately latched onto that. It was a thing that she seemed to romanticize in her own mind, like a Hollywood movie she could play out in real time in real life. A young, rich, beautiful, bored heiress is secretly operating in this drug trafficking underworld. And boredom, dreamers, that's the one thing that I keep coming back to in all of this. I don't know what Lisette Lee would be doing with herself if not for the fantasy life that she's built. She has money, but if not for touting herself as a fake model, singer, and actress, then who or what would she be? I just think that she was bored, and all of this was highly entertaining for her. And she kept needing to change and evolve and add to the story every time she grew tired of what she was doing. And that's pretty much what David Garrett thought he was the motivation for what was to come. Over the course of their relationship, he shared with Lisette that he had a pretty big-time marijuana connection, a supplier that he would be able to get hundreds and hundreds of pounds of marijuana from, as he had some buyers in Ohio. Much to David's surprise, Lisette was interested. He just didn't think that she, being from this extremely rich family, would ever want to get involved in something like that, but she did. And like I mentioned before, I figured a lot of what motivated Lisette stemmed from boredom, and he thought the exact same thing. He figured she had been part of this glamorous life, and he knew she had an affinity for movies like Scarface. Tony Montana was one of her favorite fictional characters, and it's been said that Lisette patterned herself after him, with the way she acted, the way she carried herself, the way she treated people. That's what life was like for Lisette. The world was a movie, and she was the star. So this was the deal. David had a connection in Arizona where he would be able to purchase the marijuana at a cost of $500 a pound. He would be able to take that to Ohio, sell it for $1,000 a pound, netting him a profit margin of 100%. The only hitch was transporting thousands of pounds of marijuana halfway across the country. This is where Lisette comes into play. She had exactly what they needed in order to make that happen. She was the one with the jet-setting lifestyle. In other words, she had access to private jets. They would be able to move the marijuana quickly, but most importantly, it would be very discreet. And flying by private jet would enable them to carry so much marijuana, it would very easily be worth the cost of chartering the jet, which would be about $50,000 per trip. David Garrett on his own, with his tattoos and his gangster appearance, would not be able to get away with chartering a private jet without raising a few eyebrows. The assumption would be that he was up to no good and he wouldn't be able to do it. But Lisette could totally pull it off. After all, she is of Samsung royalty, right? Nobody would think twice about her. By the time the opportunity to traffic drugs presented itself to Lisette, she had already mastered her character of a famous, spoiled socialite. So with that, the plans were laid out. David would be in charge of acquiring the marijuana and handling the sales and the transactions, and Lisette would handle the transport. She would also assemble the staff. I mentioned some of the people already. They've all been a part of Lisette's entourage, for the most part as she masqueraded as a Samsung heiress. But now that they were going into the drug trafficking business, everyone in a bizarre way was going to have a quote-unquote legit job, so to speak. Rather than working for the fake heiress, they were now working for the real drug smuggler. So the plan was to assemble a team that Lisette would call Team LL. And everybody would have a code name that they would go by, starting with Lisette. She was 007. Everybody else were the other numbers, 001, 002, and so on. There would be a total of 7 people involved, give or take. Some would be on some trips, some would not. Lisette was going to tap the services of many of the individuals that had been a part of her inner circle. They were people who had somewhat of a loosely defined role in her life in one capacity or another. The first person she recruited to be a part of this new venture that she was embarking upon would be none other than her BFF, Miley Caddy. She told her that there was this thing that had presented itself to her. Miley has said that Lisette never divulged what it was that they were doing, just that she had a job for her, and that job was to be her personal assistant. According to Rolling Stone, Lisette told her, "I'm going to be able to hire you now, even though you are underqualified." So even though Lisette was willing to extend herself finally to Miley and offer her a much-needed job that would pay her a flat rate of $1,500 per trip, she still had to slip that jab in there to remind Miley that she wasn't good enough for the job. But Lisette was willing to look past that as her friend and offer it to her. By this time, Miley was so relieved to not only be making money, but to actually be in somewhat of a better place in her relationship with Lisette. She didn't even really care what the work involved. But it didn't matter. Miley didn't ask a lot of questions, nor did Lisette divulge a lot of details. Now, I'm just sitting here thinking about Lisette and David Garrett here. You know, Miley here, she has this friend in Lisette, who she thinks is a really famous and wealthy heiress. She's shown pictures of herself gracing the cover of European Vogue magazine, that she's a model, that she's a pop star, that she's part of the Samsung family, that she's dated Leonardo and she's dated Channing. She's even told people that she dated soccer player Cristiano Ronaldo. There were times when it appeared that she was living with wine connoisseur to the stars Christian Navarro, while at other times she seemed to be looking for places on her own, telling real estate agents that she was formerly a student of law at Harvard and she turned international supermodel instead. But yet, here she was, hanging out with regular old street criminal David Garrett. But, like I said, Miley just didn't question things. Another person Lisette recruited onto Team LL was the doorman of the building that she lived in, at the time a 22-year-old guy named Henry Hernandez. She had told him many of the same tales that she told everyone, her entire fictitious backstory, and he, of course, had no reason to not believe her. He was just the guy who opened the door for her every time she came and went. And on top of that, Lisette was also romantically involved with him as well. Another everyday kind of guy working a menial job, holding doors open for the rich and richer. Henry was a nice, polite young man. He regularly attended church. He had been enrolled in college, but eventually just dropped out because he needed to work more. He needed the money. He got to know Lisette in her comings and goings from the building at which he worked and she lived. They became friends, and soon they became romantically involved. Eventually, as the drug trafficking opportunity presented itself, Lisette brought up the possibility of Henry working for her. She wanted to hire him as her driver on this quick trip. She offered him $3,000. Henry, of course, jumped at the chance to earn that kind of money, and he figured Lisette must have really taken a liking to him. After all, she had gifted him a ring made of titanium, which he proudly wore. He, like many of the men in Lisette's life, was crazy in love with her. By November of 2009, Team LL was ready to make its first trip. Lisette had made all the arrangements for the private jet. Rolling Stone had mentioned that she used a chartered jet broker. Now, I know this may come as a shock to many of you, but I have never chartered a private jet. So I looked into it quickly and to see what the need for a broker was, and basically it's like any other capacity in which a broker helps with a transaction between a buyer and a seller. In this case, it's to help you through the process of getting a jet in an industry that many people are unfamiliar with. It is a competitive industry, so they help you get the best price for what you need. They're able to tell you who owns the jet, where it's from. They can provide you information regarding safety, quality, and to ensure that you get what you need from the trip that you're wanting to make, as the industry itself is largely unregulated and not always consumer friendly. So the pricing can sometimes be all over the place. There is really little oversight when it comes to how companies treat their clients and if they're operating with integrity and high standards. Brokers often have relationships with the owners. They know which companies they can trust, and they're able to protect the interest of both the client and the owners. And they can also make sure that if something happens that causes the plane that you've chartered to be unable to make the flight, a good broker can guarantee a recovery aircraft within a matter of a couple hours. So, Lisette chartered the jet. And as always, using one of her many stories, that she's a model going to a photo shoot, that she's a Korean pop star going to film a music video, that she's an heiress looking for a little getaway, or that she's some poor little rich girl looking to move to Middle America to get away from the glamorous life. Of course, even though Lisette sees herself as the Queenpin of the operation, she is 007, right? She is going to take steps to make sure that her hands stay as clean as possible. And one of the ways that she intended to do that was to funnel all of the money that she was spending on the travel expenses, including chartering the jet, through Miley's sad little empty bank account. Miley did what she could to object to it. I mean, it's like, you're Lisette Lee, heiress/model/singer. Why in the world would she need to use her account to pay for everything instead of her own? But Lisette quickly shut Miley down, and according to Rolling Stone, she snapped, "Babe, I could throw a stick out the window and hit a girl in the effing head who would do this in a second for what you're getting paid. It's effing insulting when you don't want to work for it. So Miley abruptly shut up about it and complied, as she always had. The night before the first flight, everyone got together for one last meeting at David's apartment. Lisette had specific instructions as to what everyone was to be wearing when they took off. During this meeting, 17 suitcases were delivered to the apartment, all loaded with the shipment of marijuana that would be headed to Ohio the following day. The last 2 people added to Team LL was Lisette's so-called longtime bodyguard, Frank Edwards. At the time, he was only 39 years old. Lisette was really about 28. So the story that she was trying to sell, that Frank had been her bodyguard since she was the age of 3, didn't make a whole lot of sense, as he would have only been 14 years old at the time. But hey, nobody dared question Lisette, right? Besides, she was passing herself off as 22 years old or so. But seeing as she was pushing 30, I don't know how many people were really buying that anyway. I can only imagine the gossip that was going on behind Lisette's back amongst the people that were closest to her. Well, Frank would later say that he figured that he was just something Lisette needed to have around her in order to make her seem more important than she actually was, because in all the time that he did work as her bodyguard, there was never really anything that he needed to protect her from. Like, the celebrities that are out there, even the ones who are famous for no other reason than just being famous, like Paris Hilton or any of the Kardashians, they're constantly hounded by paparazzi. But that wasn't really ever the case with Lisette. You'd think that if she was as famous as she said she was, she'd be followed by the paparazzi too. But again, nobody questioned it. So also added to Team LL was a guy named Young Ko. He was a friend of David's who was recently out of work, and he too worked in the security business. With everyone present, the plan was laid out. They would go to the smaller, lesser-known Van Nuys Airport that famous people preferred to use as opposed to LAX because that was so busy. They would arrive in their convoy of SUVs. Lisette, of course, would be in the Escalade. Everybody else would be in regular old Chevy Suburbans. Those would be loaded with the luggage that would be loaded with the marijuana. They'd get everything and everybody onto the jet, and they'd take off for Ohio. When they arrived, they would all be picked up by limos waiting for them, and they would go to their hotel and just wait. And in a couple of days, they would all be taken back to the airport with all of their suitcases, which by this time would be empty. They'd fly back to Van Nuys, and they'd be taken home. And Team LL had really pulled off a persuasive sense that this group of nobodies were actually a Hollywood entourage. David, Frank, Young, Henry, they were all dressed in black suits and ties. Miley had on professional attire, a pencil skirt, a nice blouse, glasses that she didn't even need to see, and her hair was in a professional updo. And then there was Lisette. Huge Chanel sunglasses, a fur coat, and both her and her chihuahua barking at everybody. And the more Lisette became this illusion of who she wanted the world to think that she was, the worse she treated everybody else on Team LL. To a point where Miley even had to step in and was like, whoa, maybe could you dial it down a little bit? But Lisette was way over the top in this role that she was born to pretend to play, right? And she snapped back at Miley and said, no, this is me. I'm a bitch, and I'm not going to pretend to be something that I'm not. And the irony of that statement is not lost on any of us, right? Team LL made a pair of trips in November, a pair in December, bumping it up to 3 trips by January. And by then, it became apparent what was being transported. Remember, the only ones who knew what was really going on was Lisette and David, purportedly. Everyone else had been kept in the dark. But they're not stupid, and they know what marijuana smells like. And it was clear that the distinct odor was filling the plane every time they flew. So Lisette began ordering that the suitcases be stuffed with dryer sheets and sprayed down with Febreze, but still, it can only camouflage it so much. And just like many well-laid plans before, the things Lisette was doing here were inevitably going to begin to show cracks, to an extent. She wasn't willing to discuss what they were actually carrying in the suitcase, but the fact that everyone just sat there and acted ignorant to what it was they were smelling in the cabin of the plane is either another example of the control that Lisette had over everyone, or everyone's willingness to allow Lisette to just think that they're that stupid. And it was pretty clear that Lisette did not really think about the finer details of the plan itself. I mean, she had herself and her entourage perfectly outfitted for what they were trying to pretend to be. At least for a couple of flights, the story that they were telling the charter company and the pilot and whomever they encountered along the way was that she was a pop star and they were headed to film a video on location in Ohio, yet they really didn't have anything that one would regularly see a film crew bringing with them, such as equipment. Yeah, none of that seemed to concern Lisette, probably thinking that people would just continue to not ask questions. Also, in the Rolling Stone article, the author took issue with how Lisette gave everyone code names, starting with hers being 007. It suggested that there is this real detachment from reality when it comes to Lisette and what she was doing. The crime that she was committing carried with it a certain level of risk, as well as some very real and harsh consequences. But it was like it never even crossed her mind that they might actually get caught and get in trouble. Instead, Lisette's only focus was to keep doing what she thought she knew how to do best: manipulate and control everyone around her. I think Lisette thought that if she could keep it up, to keep people under control, to keep people from asking questions, that she was untouchable. But the fact was, everyone knew what was going on, and eventually it started to bring about a certain amount of paranoia and anxiety amongst them. No matter how blasé Lisette was about it, they knew what they were doing, and it made them nervous. Let's not forget here that two of the men involved, David Garrett and Henry Hernandez, were also intimately involved with Lisette, complicating things even more. By trip number 4, Miley said that that's when she realized what was going on here, and that she was actually a part of this drug trafficking ring. But out of her fear of Lisette and what she might do if she started asking questions or wanting to back out, and not to mention that it was her bank account that everything was being paid for, she chose to stay quiet and not say anything to Lisette about her apprehensions. Miley also told Rolling Stone that Lisette herself was changing, and it wasn't good. As a matter of fact, it was quite ugly. During the flights, Lisette took to drinking quite heavily, chugging booze right from the bottle, most of the time finishing the whole thing off before they touched down at their destination. She would sit there and fire people just to make them grovel for her to let them back. She treated people like garbage before, but it got to a point where each one of them just sat quietly and waited for their turn to be eviscerated by Lisette, because they knew it was coming. It was only a matter of who and when. David Garrett said in the interview that she treated people like dogs. But really, dreamers, I know the analogy being made here, but I'm pretty sure that she treated them worse, way worse than that. It got to a point where David began to fear for his life, based simply on the things that Lisette would threaten. She would say regularly, "I'm going to bury you. I have a hitman on speed dial. I have an army of investigators who are tapping your phones. I have all of your homes under video surveillance." None of that was true, of course, but Lisette had become so venomous, there was no telling what she was capable of. And so all good things must come to an end, right? By April of 2010, David and Lisette's relationship had hit the skids, and from what I've come to understand, the whole thing was just becoming too volatile. Not necessarily between them, but how they felt their operation needed to be handled. Obviously, Lisette was a little bit overboard with the theatrics, and from what's been said about it, Lisette's behavior was just bad for business. This was a thing that normally people try to do quietly and under the radar, and Lisette was making a big, huge production of what they were doing. And it was all because, like I said, she figured that she was untouchable. And the bottom line for David was that this group were a far cry from professional drug traffickers. And for him, it can turn dangerous quickly, especially if Lisette drew the wrong kinds of attention. He simply didn't trust her anymore. It also may have had something to do with the fact that she was playing him and Henry at the same time, but as far as what David has said publicly, it mostly had to do with Lisette's operation being unprofessional. So when David left, his friend Young Ko left as well, but that wasn't going to stop Lisette from moving forward with her operation. This is when she brought in a man named Christopher Cash. And as it turns out, he was actually the charter jet broker who had arranged for all the flights for Lisette. But for some reason, Lisette called him Richard, and I have no idea why, but I imagine it was one of those things that Lisette started calling him, and no matter how many times he attempted to correct her by telling her his name was Christopher, she ignored him and continued calling him by the name that she wanted to. It did not take long for him to pick up on what Lisette was doing here when she was making all of the arrangements for the flights through him. And instead of doing the right thing and reporting the illegal activities, he too was lured in by the irresistibility of the operation and of Lisette, as he pretty much slid right into the place that David Garrett had left vacant. Even though Lisette still had Henry Hernandez as a boyfriend, he was boyfriend number 2. He didn't get bumped up into the number 1 slot when David bailed out. Christopher Cash became her number 1. Henry was realizing that he was never going to be more than Lisette's doorman and her doormat. Christopher would end up accompanying Team LL on 2 out of the 14 trips. By the time Christopher was brought onto Team LL, it seemed as though Miley was beginning to realize that Lisette was not all of the things that she claimed to be. Outside of Lisette, Miley was able to forge friendships with others who were real and genuine people that Miley came to trust and confide in. This is most likely the exact thing that Lisette worked very hard at trying to prevent. Because, when Lisette met Miley, she was naive, a small-town girl from rural Pacific Northwest, who could be easily chewed up and spit out by somebody like Lisette. But if Miley was going to persist and endure in living in Los Angeles, she was going to have to learn some hard lessons. I don't blame Miley for falling for Lisette's con, but she was wrapped up in that world with her for the better part of 4 years. I do think Miley could have cut her relationship short with Lisette long before they ever got started with the drug trafficking, or even after a few trips in when Miley realized what it was they were actually doing. But she stayed, even when she knew better. After 4 years of dealing with a person like Lisette, Miley had to have known and understood much more than when she first landed in LA fresh out of Washington State. And among one of the friends that Miley made during her time living in Los Angeles was a young woman with whom she'd become pretty close. This friend did in fact grow up in a very wealthy family, and there was an occasion when Miley brought this friend out to dinner with Lisette one time. Miley very rarely brought other people around Lisette, and from this one encounter, it's easy to see that there was a very good reason for that. Lisette is only capable of fooling certain people. Just look at the group that she surrounded herself with as we've gone through this story. Miley, a naive young girl who just believed everything at face value. David Garrett, a guy who was really not about anything more than being involved in small-time drug dealing. Henry Hernandez, her doorman. And everybody else, Scott Cooper, Christopher Cash, they were all manipulated because they were attracted to her. Those were the only kind of people that Lisette could control. All of them, Lisette made sure, were beneath her. At least, she made them think that they were. But anyway, after having dinner with Miley and Lisette, this friend of hers had some very astute observations to share with Miley once they were alone again. Lisette's look is cheap. Everything about her is bargain basement. The Chanel necklace Lisette had on was a fake. And most glaringly, Lisette is hardly a refined woman of wealth and social status. She lacked any sort of politeness, etiquette, decorum, and manners. She was vulgar, ostentatious, just not what someone of the Samsung family would reflect. So, I guess if you've never been around billionaires, then you'd never know how differently they are in everyday social settings. Lisette's version of a wealthy socialite heiress is the perception of what we think they act like when nobody is looking, when the camera is off. We tend to think that they're divas who make outlandish demands of their staff. Lisette was being that diva everywhere she went. So on this occasion, when she was around someone from real wealth, it was immediately off-putting. Then there was this funny thing that I read in the Rolling Stone article. Not too long after that dinner where Miley's friend explained why she was sure Lisette was a fraud, Miley had gone by Lisette's new condo, which was located at the Remington on the very exclusive section of Wilshire Boulevard in Los Angeles. I looked it up just to see, and a condo there starts at about $4 million, with the penthouses costing upwards of $16 million. So, as Lisette is showing Miley around her new place, she pointed out a pair of paintings that she had recently been gifted by her mom. Lisette went into this long, detailed story as to how the artist was a longtime friend of the family who is renowned for his work all over France. Miley was pretty wowed by the story. That is until she saw that same exact pair of paintings being sold as wall art at a local Bed Bath & Beyond a week later. So again, it's another example of Lisette putting a great deal of effort into all of the details without concerning herself much about anything beyond the story, making her look good. But still, Miley decided that the best thing to do was to stay quiet. She said that she really cared for Lisette and that she loved her, as she would have loved any of her best and closest friends. And she just could not quite be convinced that everything about Lisette was a fraud. But that was also coupled with the fact that if she allowed herself to accept that everything Lisette ever told her was a lie, then what would that mean for her? What kinds of trouble would she find herself in? Would Lisette follow through on one of her many, many threats that Miley heard her make over the years? Lisette pretty much threatened serious repercussions and even harm to anyone who dared cross her. After Miley had these pair of eye-opening things happen to cause her to doubt everything she ever knew about Lisette, when it came time for another flight to Ohio on a jet packed with hundreds of pounds of marijuana, Miley attempted to wiggle her way out of going. She came up with what she thought was a fairly legitimate reason to hang back from that flight. But it just sent Lisette's temper off all over again, where she pummeled Miley with a barrage of humiliation and degradation. How dare you F up this job? I put my neck on the line for you, and this is how you repair me. Who do you think you are? Miley was just unable to muster the emotional or mental fortitude to find a way out of this. It all came to a head on Monday, June 14th, 2010. This was Team LL's 14th trip from Van Nuys to Ohio. It was the 14th time in 8 months that she was either filming a music video, doing a modeling shoot, or moving to Ohio. What Lisette didn't realize or even bother to take into consideration is that she had been given the same pilot on several of the trips. And you have to admit, as ridiculous as Lisette probably was, she was also something else, which is memorable. As the pilot of a chartered jet, she or he probably sees all sorts of things when it comes to the eccentricities of the wealthy. So not only was the pilot quite familiar with Lisette and Team LL's little routine, so had several others who had worked at the airport. Lisette came with the same song and dance every time. But the one thing that started to raise the suspicions was about the third time that Lisette said that she was moving to Ohio. Because how many times is one person going to move to Ohio? And how many $50,000 chartered jets are you going to need? I'm going to go out on a limb here and say probably 0. On top of that, every single one of those 17 suitcases that she carried with her was impossibly heavy. Even for the biggest guy who played her bodyguard, struggled to move each piece. On this trip, Lisette had only 3 of her staff with her. Miley, her boyfriend Christopher, and her bodyguard Frank. As they made their way from California to Ohio, somebody finally called BS on Lisette and contacted the DEA in Columbus. They were on the tarmac when their jet landed. No amount of indignancy, no amount of Lisette saying, "Do you know who I am?" was going to get her out of this. It was over. As Lisette's case made its way through court, the truth about her began to surface. Rolling Stone called it even stranger and harder to believe than what she'd been telling everyone, even though there were many shades of the truth intertwined. Lisette was born to a single mother in 1981. Her real name is Ji-Yun Lee. Her family, testifying on her behalf in court, said that her mom's name was Corinne Lee, and that she was in fact the daughter of the founder of Samsung, Byung-Chul Lee, thus making Lisette a member of the richest and most private families in South Korea. However, Lisette's father was a man named Yoshi Morita, and he was a casino mogul. And because of the interracial nature of their relationship and the resulting child that they had together, Lisette's mother and father could never be married. The existence of Lisette would be an enormous shame on the prominent Samsung family. So she was given up for adoption to a friend of her father's who had become friends with while studying martial arts. Lisette's adopted father, Bum Gyo Lee, who was a 6th-degree black belt and was referred to formally as Master Lee, took her in. He also provided testimony on behalf of Lisette in court. Master Lee and his wife Lauren brought Lisette to the United States and raised her as their own. Master Lee worked as a private Taekwondo instructor for those who worked in the movie industry, and the family settled down in a modest apartment in Beverly Hills. Lisette did not attend exclusive prep schools as she had claimed, her family opting for her to live as normal a life as possible, sending her to public school. But once Lisette was set to enter high school, Master Lee did not want to send her to Beverly Hills High. He thought it was a bad environment, with drug use being rampant amongst the students on the campus. So he kept her out of public high school, choosing to have her homeschooled instead. Though as Master Lee worked hard at keeping Lisette grounded, her mother and father, her biological mother and father, were very much a presence in her life, while not always physically, but they were financially. And this is where Lisette's money came from. Lisette would be the first to admit it. If Master Lee had said no to her, she immediately ran to her biological parents, particularly her father, and they'd always say yes to her. Her father would send her about $100,000 a month as she frequently traveled around the world and was spoiled rotten by her biological parents. However, it was very much against what Master Lee wanted for Lisette. Both of her fathers adored her, but Master Lee felt it was important to instill simple, humble values, while Marita was flamboyant and excessive. For example, when Lisette turned 16, he gifted her 2 cars, a Mercedes-Benz and a Ferrari. Eventually, it got to the point where Master Lee and Marita could no longer raise Lisette together in this manner. Master Lee felt that there was only room for one father to parent Lisette, and he finally gave Marita the ultimatum. He would no longer raise Lisette as long as Marita continued to be a part of her life. He had to completely remove himself. Master Lee explained to the court that he worried so much about Lisette and what this life of excess was doing to her, and he believed the only way to protect her was for her to have only one father, so he demanded that Marita stay out of Lisette's life. And this is where Lisette began learning how to juggle men, so to speak. She began seeing her biological dad without her adoptive dad's knowledge, so the money kept coming. And what this ultimately led to is what we see happen to a lot of bored rich kids. They become bored rich young adults. They don't know what to do with themselves because they have been so oversaturated and overstimulated their entire lives with an abundance of wealth that nothing means anything to them anymore. And Lisette really didn't know what to tell people that she was doing or who she was. Thus, we have the onset of trying to figure out what is her identity, what is her place in life. She did try modeling and singing and found it to be boring. She had aspirations of being an actress when she was young, but as soon as she hit adulthood, she was more lost than ever. Then she became involved with Christian Navarro, the wine guy, and he was about something. He had gone from working with his mother as a child, who was a restaurant consultant, all the way up to being a well-respected president of a California winery. But if I had to guess, Lisette probably grew bored with him quickly too. And she's even said it herself. He tried to tell her to not fall victim to her trust fund. There were days when she said she wondered if she even needed to get out of bed. What was there to do when she got up? Where was she going to go? The only things that she knew how to do was being a useless rich girl. Are we feeling sorry for Lisette? I'm not, but I do have a sense of the confusion and the unhappiness that she seemed to be feeling. Ultimately, Lisette turned out to not be a very pleasant person, and she treated people very badly, and there was no reason for her to do that. And what ended up being laid out in court was we have here a young woman who was lost in a perpetual crisis of not knowing who she was. From the handful of name changes, trying to figure out with whom she would have aligned herself when it came to her family, Master Lee or Marita. And for some reason, the answers as to who Lisette Lee really seemed to present itself when she took on the role of the drug Queenpin of Beverly Hills. Because you see, in Japan, where her biological father was a casino mogul, wealthy men like him were considered to be akin to gangsters. And with that, she felt that the role that she was born to play was that of the gangster's daughter, a mafia princess. If she had not been adopted by Master Lee, then that would have been her fate. That is what would have been written in the stars for Lisette. When she began running those drugs from California to Ohio, it's been said that she truly believed that she was fulfilling her destiny. In June of 2011, Lisette pleaded guilty and was sentenced in federal court to 6 years for her role in the drug trafficking. The judge noted that he believed that she was young and naive, but also with some shades of narcissism. It's worth noting that in a search of her home following her arrest, there was a press release from Samsung discovered that announced an important event featuring third-generation heiress Lisette Lee, and the date on it was June 13th, 2010, the day before she was arrested. So it's been thought that maybe Lisette was ready to step away from what she was doing and embrace her role within the Samsung family business. However, once the news of Lisette's antics hit the press and her link to Samsung was in all the headlines, Samsung quickly released a statement saying that the press release with the Samsung header was a fake and Lisette Lee was in no way related to the Samsung family Lees. She admitted that she never went to the schools that she said she went to, nor did she ever grace the cover of Vogue. But Lisette insists that she never lied. She just simply omitted the truth. And she admittedly did not care enough about anything or anyone to put any effort into being honest. She never really had any friends, as others only mattered in terms of how they met what she wanted or needed. Otherwise, everyone was disposable. David Garrett received a 10-year sentence. Frank Edwards, 1 year. Young Ko, 3 years. Christopher Cash, 4 years. Henry Hernandez, 9 months. Miley, 1 month plus a year of house arrest. To Miley, Lisette is nothing more than a sociopath. To Lisette, she is simply nothing more than a Hollywood tale born in a place known as the City of Dreams. You invent and reinvent yourself into whoever your heart desires. Nobody who has a Hollywood story is truly genuine, and Lisette Lee sees herself as no different. She just went a little bit too far. Prison did bring about Lisette's first real job that she ever had, serving up chow as her fellow inmates lined up for meals. Lisette did tell the author of the Rolling Stone article that her all-expense-paid vacation at the government's resort has been a journey of learning, while she isn't playing tennis or doing yoga, of course. So, Lisette Lee wrote a response to the August 30th, 2012 Rolling Stone article. And this is what Lisette Lee had to say in her own words. I realized that the article written about me was not going to be a puff piece. That, like any normal human being, there would be things that I would not like hearing about myself. Fair enough. This was a time in my life when I was involved with some pretty unsavory characters, and my actions were completely out of integrity for myself. This is indisputable. Sabrina Rubin Ederle had been tracking this story and contacting me since 2010 to gain my participation for an article that she had been paid to write for Rolling Stone. Sabrina explained that she had always been intrigued by my story and wondered, why does a person of privilege take such an unexpected turn with her life? Sabrina specifically promised to humanize me and write about a very complex character with a lot of riches and depth. These were Sabrina's own words and the exact promises that she made to me. After her many extortions and overtures to land an interview with me, and with the promise that I would be well served to participate, I believe that Sabrina would write a fair and accurate portrayal of what actually happened and why. In hindsight, it was a mistake to trust Sabrina Rubin Ederle. Understandably, I did not want anything to impact my appeal to the court, so I held off participating. but Sabrina went ahead anyway and wrote the first draft and submitted it to her editors. By her own admission, she only had half the story. Again, her words verbatim. All I have is the point of view of other people, as well as the portrait that's been painted in legal documents, and they are not particularly kind. And that the theory she had about me was kind of speculative. When I agreed to sit down and tell my side of the story with Sabrina in early May, no topic was off the table. Even though there were some private family matters that Sabrina knew in advance that I would need to dance around. Immediately afterwards, Sabrina told my people that I was terrific, wonderful, enchanting, and great to meet in person. Apparently, the colored contact lenses matching my regulation blues and supposed penchant for quote-unquote slippery talk was not an issue then, when Sabrina literally squealed with delight in finally securing her interview. My greatest fear was that this would be a takedown piece, a total hatchet job. That fear, unfortunately, has been realized. There are so many things I dispute about the article. 3 things jump out. First, the overall context Sabrina creates. Hardly the richness and depth that she promised. Sabrina takes every cheap shot possible to make me look like a complete head case. Second, the article is not a fair and accurate portrayal of me. Instead, it relies on a very small subset of people who knew me, and apparently not very well. Then, even after she confided that calling someone a liar is a terrible thing to ascribe to a person, she proceeds to call me a sociopath, a great liar, and a master of deception, and an expensive tart. All completely defamatory, salacious, and frankly catty. Third, the article closes with a glib statement. Notice no quotation marks whatsoever, that I expect my prison sentence to be shortened by a judge any day now. I never said that, nor would I ever presume that the judge in my case to treat me any differently than he always has, which has been nothing but professional and fair. Thank you for the opportunity to rebut this article, its context and content. Lisette Lee, Dublin, California. And Sabrina herself responded in the article. She said, I spent 2 years working on this story and tried to include Lee from the very beginning, inviting her to participate at every turn. Only when we were on the brink of publication did she finally agree to be interviewed. And then, even then, I found her to be evasive. I never misled Lee to believe that I'd portray her in a falsely positive light or in any way contrary to the truth. My intent, as I repeatedly told her, was to paint a full portrait of a person who is nothing if not complex. The resulting article is far from a hatchet job. Rather, I was as sympathetic as I possibly could have been, given everything that I've learned about Lisette Lee. And that will bring this 144th episode of California Dreaming to a close. Please come to our Facebook discussion group if you already haven't done so and request to join. It is there that we discuss the cases that we cover, we share our thoughts and opinions, and we don't only talk about this podcast, but any other podcast that you listen to, documentaries that you've watched, books that you've read, as well as the current news stories about everything going on in the world. We post about our pets. We post funny memes. Please come over and share. You can also go over to the show's Facebook page and like that page and leave a review or a recommendation. You can also follow us on Twitter at CaliforniaPod and Instagram at CaliforniaDreamingPod. And this week, I would like to wish a very happy birthday to Julie O on April 22nd, Roberta B on April 23rd, Temray I on April 25th, Scott Holloway on April 26th, Lindsay Gonzalez on April 27th, and April Barber on April 29th. California Dreaming is brought to you by the Orbital Jigsaw Network, a podcast production company on a mission to create some of the best podcasts to listen to, with an amazing roster of shows with content including true crime, history, sports entertainment, gaming, and social media. So go visit our website at www.orbitaljigsaw.com. There you will find links to all of our podcasts, as well as a direct link to our merchandise store where you can get your California Dreaming t-shirt or your phone case or whatever else you see on the store. That's www.orbitaljigsaw.com. Thank you again so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you all are hanging in there as we get through this pandemic. I'm your host, Roseanne. Until next time, sweet dreams.